Welcome back to Passionate World Talk Radio. Educate, enlighten, entertain. And this morning on Cool Your Heels with Lillian, our special guest is Dr. Lynn Bukta, who is going to be talking to us why people don't pay much attention to climate change. So good morning, Lynn. How are you?
I'm good. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. It's a little bit, gray, kind of matches the grayness of the stock market and the grayness of the sea virus, but outside of that, I'm fine.
Excellent.
And so, as a psychologist, what do you find interesting about people who are aware of climate change, but they don't pay much attention to it?
Well, one of the challenges with the topic of climate change and individual opportunity to do something about it is that it's much bigger than what any one individual can do. So then it becomes fairly overwhelming to individuals to think about what behaviors, what kind of impact they can actually have. And people question, if I do X, if I make behavior change Y, if I support this kind of policy, will it make a difference? And it's very hard for us as individuals to see what that potential impact is. We don't get immediate feedback about our behavior having made a difference, so it becomes harder then to activate and do things differently.
Will something from the news studios, for example, where they run these inspirational stories, would it take maybe an inspirational story from a community to show what they're doing to make a difference with climate change, to motivate other individuals to do the same?
That could help. Certainly, anything that we can help individuals understand the kinds of behaviors that they can engage in that are impactful will be very helpful.
So what are some of the things that you would recommend to a community or to a neighborhood or a school that would help impact people's lives in understanding the crisis of climate change?
Well, there's sort of two different questions there. One is sort of how do you help people understand the crisis of climate change? And that involves presenting information about it in a way that individuals will understand it. Some individuals are really adept with understanding data and statistics. Other individuals, that's kind of overwhelming. So you need to think about who the audience is and how you want to present content about it in a way that's going to be most accessible. At the community level, it can be really helpful to point out, gee, our growing season 20 years ago started on this date, but now it's starting 2 weeks earlier. That's what climate change does for us. If that continues, here's what it will look like. So we want to try to personalize the information so that people understand what it means for right where they are. That's a way to really help people grasp the reality of what's happening. When we talk about climate change in places like Antarctica or the Arctic, most of us have never been there and are unlikely to ever be there. So we can see pictures, but it doesn't feel very real. But if we can make it real about our own local communities, 100 years ago, here's the number of floods that we had. But now we're seeing floods happening on this kind of frequency, and it seems to be because of these things. So if people can understand what the local reality is, and then start talking about the kinds of things that they can do in the local setting that may mitigate some of those issues.
I remember when I was in grade school, and it's back in the 50s, folks, okay? And they started showing us a movie about a possible World War III and the nuclear bomb. And they showed you what the after effects of the nuclear bomb was like back in the 50s. Well, that was 50 years ago, and we know that atomic bombs have changed. But I still retain and see the graphic images that were presented in that film. Could the same thing be done to show students today what will happen to their part of the woods, their neighborhood, when climate change really starts affecting where they live?
That could be very motivating for some individuals. You have to really, when presenting information like that, we've seen this when we talk about the ravages of smoking on lungs. We've seen this when we've talked about the impact, as you're talking about with war. We've seen this on the impact of drunk driving. You want to provide sort of just enough to let people understand how bad it would be without scaring them to the point where they feel like, oh, what can I do?
because I know they used to have smashed cars
Mhm.
in the pavement in
Yep.
colleges to be a vocal point for teenage drivers to recognize that driving drunk or driving under the influence or drugs or even texting while you're driving is taking a life, yours, not to mention anybody else who's in your realm. So I would think that something along those lines of maybe not being able to eat certain foods because they can't be grown anymore, they can't be transported anymore, would be a wake up call. Or would you consider that too in your face?
Uh, it's a good question. We don't really know, right? We haven't done that kind of demonstration to see if it leads to change. So it would be really important to do that, and maybe we do need to get to the point of being very dramatic about it, and really pointing out what could happen. Certainly when we talk about like car crashes, right, with showing what a car crash is, a drunk driving crash would be, and what might happen, that can be a short-term deterrent for individuals. It's not clear that it has a long-term impact. So if we can do some things that on a short term will get people to think about their behavior and how to change it, we also then on a long term need to figure out how do we get that behavior change to stick. And we're still trying to figure that out when it comes to behavior change as it relates to the environment. Probably it's going to need to be multiple ways of messaging it.
Now, what about that young teenager who is speaking out and gathering thousands of younger people to support her? Do people consider her a prophet in that respect and react to her the wrong way because her message is so much in your face?
For some people, that's going to be the way to deliver the message and to get it out there. Some people are going to respond to that, and it's going to get them activated and motivated. Others are going to feel threatened by it, and they may feel threatened by it because maybe it's science that they don't understand, don't think is accurate, don't accept that science. Maybe they're not willing to consider that a young person has some information that's valuable and necessitates some change. Maybe it's the idea that what we've got is what I have is good. I live a comfortable life. Why do I want to change it? For many Americans, the idea that maybe we don't air condition our homes as much as we typically do or run or heat the way we usually do, it's going to involve perhaps having a different way of defining comfort. And people may not want to do that. That's, at the individual level, that feels like a sacrifice. And people have a hard time with those kinds of changes, particularly if they're not going to see an immediate difference as a result of those changes.
What about a subliminal message that was used, I guess, during the 60s and 70s, I think, to encourage people to drink alcohol? Would something like that be used maybe, and to get the message across that it's not so much you, but what you're leaving to your grandchildren and their children that will be affected?
Well, certainly messages about, for a segment of the population, messages about what the impact will be for kids and grandkids really is powerful. That does help people who have generations to be thinking about. That does help them. We've seen some suggestions that does help people consider how can I change behavior. But the biggest challenge with the climate change is my individual behaviors don't have an obvious impact. So I have to understand how lots of us in individual behavior change could have an impact and how big policy kinds of changes will have an impact. And that's why the individual behaviors, people have a harder time with that because it's harder to see the change that it's going to make.
So what are doctors like you suggesting? How can people change their behavior? Our behavior hasn't changed as far as I can see since we've come down from the trees. It's the same behavior that dictates wars between countries and wars for denomination and wars over resources and wars over not having enough food. And that behavior has not changed. So how can we change our present behavior to be more acclimated to what's going on now as opposed to 50 years ago or 20 years ago?
Right. What you were talking about in terms of the wars over resources, that's really a lot of the challenge right now. We still see our particular in-group, whether it's our family, our local community, our country, that we need to protect what we've got, and we are not thinking on a global basis. It feels very much like, well, if I give up something, it's not necessarily going to benefit me. It might benefit these other people, but ultimately, in the end, we have to think beyond that and consider this is really a global environment, a global world that we're in. There are ways to do that in terms of trying to help people in one part of the world feel more connected to people in other parts of the world, to not feel like distant others, but that we're all in the game together. So the more that we can encourage individuals and find ways to help individuals see that folks in low-level countries like Bangladesh, where flooding is going to become more and more prevalent, are not individuals who deserve anything less than what we have, that will help sort of change the whole global picture there. Individuals in this country, in the U.S., in Western world where they have more resources, will have to, if we're going to have behavior change, we're going to have to start understanding how it's a world question now, and that ultimately it will come and affect those of us in easier and more populated, resourced areas. But in waiting for others to change is not going to help us in the long run, but to understand that we're all in this together to make a difference around the climate, and to then begin to identify the things that we can do individually and collectively that will start to bend that curve a little bit.
So you're talking about getting more to the students, to the college kids, the high school crowd, junior high, and the elementary schools, where you can start shaping a different type of behavior than the behavior that is being seen from the adults.
Certainly that's some of it, but you can also help change adult behavior.
Oh, you put out M&Ms?
Well, one of the things that we've seen when you're trying to get individuals to reduce their utility consumption, for instance, when you give them messages about how everybody else in your neighborhood only uses X amount of kilowatts per hour and you're using Y, people are kind of like, oh, well, how come they're not using as much? What can I do to lower my consumption of energy? So people kind of want to keep up with their neighbors, and if you can frame your messages in ways about how the majority of people are doing X, that helps to motivate adult behavior to move towards the more eco-friendly option. But we have to be very thoughtful in how we do that and to try to get people to go towards that behavior change. But there's a little bit of a kind of competition. Well, if my neighbors are only averaging X amount of gallons of water a day, if I'm in a house with only 2, why am I using so much more? How can I reduce that? That can help to motivate people to make some of those changes as well.
And I would suspect to encourage people to use some of the modern technology that is out there to reduce the amount of water or electricity or phone usage or anything that civilization has used in such a manner that has affected the general environment.
Exactly. Programmable thermostats are wonderful for many reasons, but least of all is you can set it and walk away, and you don't have to worry about, oh, did I turn the temperature down during the day when no one's in the house? It's done. So you're already making that behavior easy to do. If we have things like wide use of public transit, we have easy access to public transit, easy access to sidewalks to get to public transit, schedules that are convenient for people during the times they're likely to use it, that will increase use of public transit and hopefully reduce then use of private transportation to get places. So the more that you can make the climate-friendly choice easy for people, the more likely they're going to do it. So that involves the infrastructure at that point.
Does it make sense to get the government involved in programs that would encourage people to save their money and to save the electricity so they can use it another day type thing?
Well, certainly the government has been involved in things like that by giving people tax credits if they put solar panels on their homes, by subsidizing public transportation. There are ways that governments do get involved in order to support these more eco-friendly options, and governments will continue to think about what is their role in trying to reduce the impact that humans are having on the earth so that we can have more sustainability.
Okay, I believe that. So do you have any plans or something in place where people can write in or contact you to find out how they can start changing their behavior?
So we have been doing some surveying to try to understand what people are talking to us about climate change and behavior. We do a regular Stress in America survey on an annual basis, and the most recent one we did a segment on climate change and anxiety related to climate change. So if you're on the APA website, apa.org, and you look for Stress in America, you'll find our climate change survey and some findings from that. In addition to that, the American Psychological Association has joined with other psychological associations around the world to first begin to promote some resolutions and identify some of the ways that psychological science, behavior science can support the kinds of changes necessary for our planet to actually survive. So certainly at APA, we've got information about that on our website as well. Under climate change, we most recently passed a resolution by our governing body, which will help to drive some of the activity of the organization to work with policy leaders in these domains so that we can try to inform decision makers about how do you create policies and activities to help people make changes. For individuals on their own, what I would really encourage people to do is think about something that they believe will have an impact on the environment. Two of them that we know really do have a big impact on the environment is changing daily transportation habits, meaning less use of driving everywhere in a car, more use of walking, biking, public transportation. That will have an important impact on the overall climate, and changing our diet so that we're consuming less meat products and eating more locally from locally sourced foods. Those both actually have a fairly important impact on the local sustainability. So choosing something in that domain, what is it I'm going to do? What's the behavior I'm going to do differently? Am I going to have 3 meatless meals a week instead of having meat every single night? That would be a behavior change to practice, get good at until you've kind of got a whole array of vegetarian recipes that you like, that people you eat with like. So you can sort of introduce behavior change one at a time to way of interacting and making choices about the world.
Don't you also need to go after the folks who trying to make arguments that having cows are healthy and it's okay to eat them, or pork or chickens or anything else for that matter, because there are large organizations that are $1 million corporations that are based on supplying meat to the world?
Certainly they are, and we are all going to have to work with how do we shift our understanding of what's necessary nutrition for people and what's necessary for our world. We've certainly seen a huge spike up in the amount of consumption around meat and animal products, and certainly the people who benefit from producing that are not going to want to see changes because it will impact their pocketbook. So helping those individuals also see options, other kinds of options for how they will still have a living and sustain the lifestyle that they would like to have. So it's a complex situation in order to get the kinds of changes that we need across the board for improved sustainability for our planet.
Oh, I know that our breadbasket is not going to be surviving too much longer because the underground reservoir water is gone. So they don't have that to put out in their fields when there are droughts. And I know that the available water sources in the U.S. have been staked by other states and cities to use. And so the water sources are beginning to disappear as well. I mean, I still think about the mighty Mississippi and how it almost but disappeared during the drought. And, of course, people could never envision the Mississippi ever disappearing off the face of the earth.
Right. And to understand how it's all connected, our behavior may feel like simply a finger in the dike. You know, we're not going to stop the flood by one small change, but if we get stuck there and don't make changes, we're no closer to the goal of improved sustainability. So individuals will need to think about the kinds of choices that they have ahead of them, but then to also work with the larger organizations to help producers in the breadbasket transition to other ways of making a living, to help individuals determine how can we sustainably feed a very growing population in a way that's not going to harm the planet further. Those are bigger picture questions. I don't have the answers to those, but I can try to work with organizations and other entities or support politicians who move towards that. And then I can make my own local changes for more sustainability within my community.
And it's important not only for this planet, but any other planet we tend to go to. I would hate to see our present behavior in terms of treating the planet going with us over to Mars.
It's an interesting question to think about what would happen should we actually have people on Mars, and how will that work?
Yes, because I know with the kind of behavior we have at the moment, it's not the kind of behavior we should be taking out to the stars or to other solar systems. It's a dangerous behavior.
Yes.
Because we're self-destructive in that behavior.
Thankfully, not that many of us will arrive on Mars. So hopefully those who are making that kind of trip possible are going to be ahead of the majority of us in thinking about what kinds of behaviors can we actually engage in these other planets.
Absolutely. So do you have anything else you would like to add, Lynn, about what's going on with our population and climate change?
I think it's important for individuals to remember that while climate change is big and it feels overwhelming, certainly the kinds of change we need has to happen on a national and an international scale. But individuals need to retain some degree of hope and motivation so that they too can make changes to support the kinds of sustainability that we need long term.
Terrific. Well, ladies and gentlemen and children of all ages, you can hear Dr. Lynn talk all about climate change and our human behavior over at https://passionateworldtalkradio.com. Right-hand side of the page, there's a menu. Click down till you come to Cool Your Heels. Click on it, and you'll see the interview. Also, if you're not technologically adept, we have a sizzle line, which means that you can pick up your phone, dial in the number, and hear the interview immediately. It's also featured in all social media, plus iTunes, iHeart, Spotify, Podcasts, Podchaser Directory, and Alexa. They're all there, so please go take a listen. And before you go away and stray, this was said in 1851, pride is generally censored and decried, but mainly by those who have nothing to be proud of. Thank you all very much for listening, and until next time, have a great day. Thank you.